One of the most shocking findings of my work was the idea that the most compassionate people I have interviewed over the last 13 years were also the absolutely most boundaried. Because
most boundary.
So I'll give you a great definition of the definition of boundary that I use in the book. Boundary is simply what's okay and what's not okay. What I think we do is we don't set boundaries. We let people do things that are not okay or get away with behaviors that are not okay. Then we're just resentful and hateful. Me, I'd rather be loving and generous and very straightforward with what's okay and what's not okay. And I did not, that I learned from the research. I was the exact opposite. I assumed for the first 35 years of my life that people were sucking on purpose just to piss me off. Mm-hmm. That's what I assumed. Yeah, right. Whether it was someone who worked for me or it was someone family member who was constantly like, I was always critical and judgy. And I was like, why are they choosing these things? Why are they making their choices? They should know better. And then when this thing came up from my therapist, what if people are doing the best they can? I thought, my husband had the most beautiful answer to that question. He said, I'll never know whether people are doing the best they can or not. But when I assume people are, it makes my life better. So now I think I am not as sweet as I used to be, but I'm far more loving.
It's not just some technique so that you can do that. That's really a way of being to nurture that soil of wholeheartedness.
Yeah. Generosity, to assume the best about people, is almost an inherently selfish act, because the life you change first is your own.
You love yourself.
Yeah. And so my question is big, B-I-G. Mm-hmm. What boundaries need to be in place for me to stay in my integrity and make the most generous assumptions about you? But generosity can't exist without boundaries, and we are not comfortable setting boundaries.
And I'm so glad that you're here, and I just want to kind of start today's teaching with this statement. I hate teaching about things that I don't do very well. I don't enjoy teaching about things that I personally struggle with as well. And today we're going to hit one of those really important, difficult topics as we bring this series, More Than a Feeling, to a close. We're going to talk a little bit about limits and boundaries. If you'd have asked me 3.5+ years ago, Jason, what do you think you would struggle the most with at Radiant Church? 3 years from now, what do you think you're going to look back and say, that was what I struggled with the most? I would not have told you, starting out, that I thought it would be understanding limits and having boundaries in life. I always knew that was there, but I would not have recognized as the thing that I would struggle with the most. But if you had to know, for the last 3.5 years, the thing I struggle with is, where are these boundaries? What limits are there in my life? How do I recognize them? How do I put healthy boundaries in my life in a way that is healthy not only for me, but for the church as well? And so this has been a constant battle for me, admitting that I have limits and understanding that I need to have healthy boundaries in my life. And I'm guessing I'm not alone on this, because I talk to a lot of people, and this idea of limits and boundaries is a difficult subject to wade through. And we're going to talk a little bit today about why this is a difficult subject and why it's so important in our lives. But today, I just want to be raw and transparent with you. I struggle with identifying limits, and I struggle with personal boundaries sometimes, knowing where those lines are and how to live them out in my life. And so I've had to just kind of say, why? Why do I struggle with things? Because the things I have to struggle with, of course, is what are the things I can't do? What are the things I don't have time to do? And the other one is, what are the things I shouldn't do? 3 questions we have to ask ourselves regularly in our lives. What are the things I can't do? What are the things I don't have time to do? And what are the things I just shouldn't do to begin with in my life? And my guess is some of you probably wrestle with questions like this as well. Ultimately, what we're saying is 2 of the big questions we have to ask ourselves in life are, what are the things I can say yes to? And what are the things I have to say no to? And a big part of being emotionally and spiritually mature is having the self-awareness to say no to things sometimes. To say, we're not going to continue at this. And when we understand that we have limits in our lives, what we're going to learn more and more today is in identifying those limits, we realize that we need boundaries in order to protect those limits. And so I want to talk about that today because as she said in the video, and probably as you've experienced in life, setting healthy boundaries is hard. It's difficult, and I had to take some time this week, really struggle and wrestle through it, just sit down and think, why do I struggle with limits and boundaries in my life, and throwing the books to the side, at some point you're like, I've read them all, okay, and then you turn the computer off and just really thinking like, why do I struggle with these things? And I want to share with you 4 ways that I struggle with boundaries in my life. May not be a fully comprehensive list, but I'm guessing some of these you struggle with as well. And so let's talk about them today. The first reason I think that boundaries are so hard in our lives is this. Practicing boundaries takes discipline. Now, discipline isn't a word most of us naturally gravitate towards, and I'm not talking about the kind of discipline we give our children in life. I'm talking about the kind of discipline it takes for a runner who wants to win the race to get up on a cold, rainy morning, put the shoes on, and go for the run, even when they don't want to roll out of bed, even when they don't want to do it. It's the discipline that says, I am focused on what's ahead. I know what I need. I need to be coached. I need to be in the weight room. I need to be running. I need to do these things if I'm going to win the race. That's the sort of discipline I'm talking about, and I think this is something that's missing out of a lot of Christians' life, is oftentimes we're like, I'm just waiting on God to act, and I think God's sitting there going, I'm waiting on you to put the shoes on and go for a run, You got to do some of this work yourself. That's why Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, I love this verse in the NLT, he says, I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should do. And so it takes discipline. There's a lot of disciplines we have in our lives. Prayer, having a prayer life and praying is a discipline. You just got to do it at some point. You have to set the time aside. You have to be diligent about it. We need to be a praying church. Reading your Bible each day, and I really do encourage you to hear from God's Word on a daily basis. You have to do it each day, but to do that, it requires discipline. You cannot learn the Bible through osmosis. I've tried. It does not work. You have to have this discipline in your life to just say, I'm going to read it. I'm going to set the time aside. And what we learn then about boundaries and healthy boundaries in our lives is you have to set the time aside for that. You have to be diligent with that. And then sometimes you just have to hold the line. Now, that gets us to our next point on why I think people struggle with boundaries. And that's this. It's hard to know where the line is. And you say, what line are you talking about, Jason? I'm talking about the line of no. When do I have to say no? Or when do I have to say stop? When do we say this doesn't go on any longer? We're not going to allow this. Where is that line where something has to change in our lives? And if I'm being honest, as I always will be, but I'm guessing if you want to be honest too, many of us struggle understanding and knowing exactly where that line is in our life. When do I say no? When do we say it ends here? This is not going to happen anymore. And this is something that everyone just kind of struggles with. We have to ask when saying no in each given situation, am I the right person to engage this situation? Do I have time to do this thing? When do I say yes? When do I say no? And why do we struggle with the line? Let's be really, really honest with each other. Because when we say no, we're afraid the other person's going to hate us. We're afraid that they're going to be upset. Many of us have built into us this nature of people pleasing. We just want to make people happy. None of us wants to tell somebody, hey, I think we've got to stop doing this thing, or this can't go on any longer. It's not healthy. It's not right. None of us wants to do that, and none of us wants to hand somebody news like that. And so the reason we struggle with where the line is and even saying no sometimes is we're afraid of the reaction we're going to get from somebody. But we have to ask ourselves, is that the right thing to do? Is the healthy thing to do in this situation to say no, or by staying in this situation and doing nothing about it, and am I enabling this person to move closer to destruction? You see, sometimes we think we're being nice when we're saying yes, when really the nicest thing we could say is no. To say, this can't go on. I can't allow you to go this direction. You can't do this thing. But I get it. It's hard. I'm there all the time. Where is that line? How do we know where that line is? How do we engage it? We might even back up and say, well, wait a minute, Jason. Did Jesus have boundaries? Were there times where he said no? Were there times where he had to hold the line a little bit? And I want to tell you there's a bunch, actually. But let's look at a couple real quick, a couple easy ones. One I picked out was in Matthew chapter 19. And some of you might know this story. It's called The Rich Young Ruler. And Jesus engages a young man who is a wealthy person. And he asks Jesus a question. He says, how can I have eternal life? Well, Jesus begins to answer that question. He says, if you want to be perfect, go sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. And notice what it says here. When the young man heard this, he went away sad because he had great wealth. Right away, Jesus put a big boundary on him. And it's not a formula, by the way, on how all of us are to engage our Christian journey. Jesus understood this young man had a greed problem. Went straight to the heart. And he put a boundary on him. Hey, you know what? Your money is your God. So if you want to serve me wholeheartedly, get rid of the idol. Go get rid of it and come follow me. He put a boundary on him right away. And what was the man's reaction? He went away sad. But I want to note one other thing that you can identify about Jesus in this story. He didn't chase after him. Did you catch that? You say, woof, that's harsh. But he didn't. You don't see Jesus chasing after him. You don't see Jesus renegotiating. Yeah, okay, maybe half. Maybe just half your stuff. Or you know what? Let's talk more about this. He put the boundary on there. He held to it, and he allowed the man to make the decision. Tough boundaries in this case. I'll tell you another really tough one. In Matthew chapter 12, we see an amazing story where Jesus is teaching in a town, and it says that while Jesus was talking to the crowd, his mother and brothers stood outside. The family showed up, and they wanted to speak to him. So someone went and told Jesus, your mother and brothers are standing outside. They want to speak to you. And he replied to them, who is my mother, and who are my brothers? And pointing to his disciples, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister, mother. Woo. You might step back and go, whoa, Pastor, wait a minute. I thought family first. I thought blood is thicker than water. Family above all things. Isn't that what we are taught? Isn't that what we're supposed to do? And you have Jesus questioning that. Saying that the will of my Father, the will of God, is supposed to be the most important thing. It's the same Jesus that would later say that this good news I'm bringing you will divide families. It will be a sword. Don't think I came to bring peace. Right away, he puts this hard boundary on things. What's he testing here? What is he challenging? And let me ask you this question. If we're called to follow God first, no matter what, let's wrestle with this question. Is it possible for your family to become an idol? Is it possible for your kids to become an idol? Tough, huh? But what happens when living through our kids and living through our family and putting them first above God? What happens when they take precedence over our call to follow Jesus no matter what? That's what he's challenging here. Tough boundary. Which forces us to ask a question from this story you have to ask in your life. Do you have the right boundaries? See, if you've got this idea that says family first, blood is thicker than water, above all things, is that the right boundary? Have you put the right thing in place? Jesus would push and challenge at that, I think. Here's the next reason I think we struggle with boundaries in our life. Boundaries and limits require tough love. They require tough love. We've kind of hinted at this already, but let me just say this. Did you know in your life there are boundary violators? There are people who don't understand boundaries, don't recognize boundaries, or just flat out ignore them. There are constant boundary violators in our life, and we have to be very, very aware of them. That's why I love this quote from Jurassic Park. It's the original one back in '93, the one that started the whole series. And there's a guy named Muldoon who was kind of the park ranger, always carried around a big gun with him. And he was having a conversation with them about the raptors. And he was talking about the fence around Jurassic Park. And he says that they're constantly attacking various areas of the fence looking for weaknesses. And I love this quote. What he says, that's right. They never attack the same place twice. They're testing the fences for weaknesses they remember. There will be people in your life who are boundary violators that do just that. Like the raptors, they're going to test the boundaries. They're going to push the limits. They're going to see how far can I go. They're going to see if you're going to hold the line. That's just their nature and how they live. And there's a couple things that are really important that you need to know about boundary violators that I've had to learn a lot in the last couple years as well. The first one is this. Most boundary violators I come across usually don't know they are boundary violators. We talked about this a few weeks ago, that part of being both emotionally and spiritually healthy is being self-aware as a person, having self-awareness. Boundary violators typically don't have the self-awareness to know that they are infringing upon other people's boundaries, that they are crossing the line. And so you have to be careful. They don't necessarily know they're boundary violators in this case. And you have to be aware of that. The second thing about boundary violators you have to know is this. They don't like boundaries. They don't like them. In fact, if you really nailed them down and they were truly honest with you, they just don't think they apply to them. And there could be a lot of reasons for it. Maybe there's just an overly neediness in their life. Sometimes this comes from narcissistic behavior where they're the center of everyone's world. There can be a lot of reasons for this, but you just have to go ahead and identify it and understand it. They don't know they're boundary violators, and they just don't like boundaries. You've got to be aware of this so that when you understand your limits and you set up boundaries, you know why you're doing it in this case. Because with boundary violators, you're going to have to clarify what the boundaries are and hold the line with it. And this requires really tough love sometimes. It sometimes requires just saying no. It requires you putting your foot down, drawing a line in the sand, whatever it may be, and saying, you're not going any further. This is where this ends. And it can be tough. I remember a guy I was meeting with at my previous church. And I say previous church because inevitably someone comes up to me after the service and says, was that me? No, previous church, all right? It's not you. He came up one day after church and he said, Pastor, would you be my accountability partner, kind of mentor me? And typically when someone says that, I try to find someone to help be their accountability partner because I can't mentor every single person in the church. It's just too hard on that case. But this gentleman's wife was on my staff, so I felt like there was an obligation to do that and was glad to do it. I said, sure, let's meet next week for coffee. And we met. And when I sat down with him, just kind of asked a question, so how's your life? And regretted asking that 45 minutes later as he began to just vomit. I hate this, I'm struggling with this person's a jerk, this thing at work's happening to me. Just lets me have it. But I figure, okay, this is healthy, this is good. And we get to about that hour time, and I'm like, listen, I got to go. So let's meet again in another week. And he said, fine. And so we met at that time, and before I could even ask, he just went at it again, just kind of going on about his life, what's going on, and just on and on and on. And about halfway through that, I said, well, hey, time out real quick. We can get back to this in a minute, but I want to be intentional about our meetings and what we're doing. So I'd love, I got a book based on some of the things you were kind of mentioning last week. I think this would be a good book for you and I to go through together. And I would love for you to read the first chapter of John. the next time we meet. That way we're keeping some focus in these conversations and identifying some things in your life to work on and so forth. And he kind of looked at me funny, and we ended the meeting there, and he went off on his way. By the third meeting, I noticed he was really late, and it's the second time he had kind of been late at this point. And when he got there, he began to, again, just kind of start his rant a little bit about what was going on. And I stopped him and I said, hey, how about what you read in the book? Some of what you're talking about was in there. And he got this nasty look on his face, and he's like, I don't read. I don't do that, man. I don't want to read a book. I'm like, okay. And I'm like, how about John? He goes, no, I don't want to read that either. I'm like, ugh. Okay. And so he starts talking again. I stopped and I said, well, hang tight. If you're not going to read, at least let me ask some questions. That thing you said to the person you told me about a few minutes ago, do you think there's maybe a way you could have said that would have been healthier or better? Or what, Challenger, that thing you did, that decision you made, how's that working for you? Was that good? And at that point, he stopped me and he said, Pastor, I don't want to read. I don't want you asking questions. I just want you to sit there and shut up while I tell you what's going on in my life. You're the pastor. That's your job. The meeting ended there. And I went home, and I thought about it. I mean, that's okay. I mean, people say things, and you want to be loving about it. And so I prayed about it, thought about it, talked to a couple pastor friends of mine, see what they thought. And the next time we met, I had to tell them, listen, I don't think you're getting better, and I don't think you want to get better. And I don't think this is working. I don't think we can go on with these meetings under the criteria which you have. He got up and he left that meeting, and I've never talked to him since. And yes, I asked myself from times, was I mean? Was I cruel? A jerk? To set that line and say, hey, I don't think this is a healthy relationship when it's just one-sided. And you're setting the criteria and we're not working together? Where's that line? And what happens when you have to have tough love with folks and say, I can no longer enable you to live in destructive behavior. I can't let this go on. And you say, well, are there other hard boundaries in Scripture? And I'd say Paul was another one of those that held boundaries in the church as well, too. One that's come up even in the last 2-3 weeks pretty much is in Titus, when he wrote to the church there, and he says, warn a divisive person once, and then warn them a second time, and then after that, have nothing to do with them. Want a hard boundary? There's one. Paul's saying, warn a divisive person once, warn them twice, and then have nothing to do with them. This is why boundaries are so hard. This is why we struggle. Because me, particularly as a pastor, I want to help people. I want people to get better. I want them to experience the life to the full that Jesus called to have. I want to be full of grace and mercy. I want to be loving. But here's something you have to remember. This is so important. Separating ourselves from those who act in destructive ways is not unloving. Let me say that again. Separating ourselves from those who are acting in destructive ways is not unloving. In fact, separating protects love. Because we are taking a stand against the things that destroy love. Did you catch that? Taking a stand against destructive behaviors isn't unloving. It is, in fact, protecting your love, because it is taking a stand against the destructive behaviors that destroy love in a relationship. And for a lot of us, we've got to flip the switch and be willing to have tough love and to hold the line. And understand that doesn't mean you're unloving. It means you're protecting the love by saying you cannot go on in these destructive behaviors any longer. It has to stop here. which means I have to ask you the tough question. Are there people and relationships in your life that are moving in destructive ways that you have held on to for too long? Are there people that you need to say no to? Not because you are unloving and not because you are a jerk, but because in order to protect the love you have to stand up against the very things that destroy love. And when someone constantly violates boundaries, and when their destructive behavior is starting to affect the people around you in your life, you got to put up a boundary. And you may have to say no. You may have to let them go. And like Jesus, you're not going to chase after them. Tough love. And here's the last reason I think I struggle with boundaries in life, and maybe you do too. If we're not careful, they can be used for the wrong reasons. We do not place healthy boundaries on people and things out of retaliation and revenge. We don't do it to punish them. We do it to hold the line on what is right. And you say, well, they make me mad when they violate boundaries or they cross lines they shouldn't. It makes me mad too. It makes me really angry. And guess what? It's okay to be angry. It's okay to get mad. In fact, I'll just borrow the quote from the guy who wrote the book Boundaries, Dr. Henry Cloud, and what he had to say. He said, one of the first signs that you're beginning to develop boundaries is a sense of resentment, frustration, or anger at the subtle and not so subtle violations in your life. Just as radar signals the approach of a foreign missile, your anger can alert you to the boundary violations in your life. You see, sometimes it's okay to get mad and it's okay to get angry, especially when somebody is crossing the lines, when they're doing things they shouldn't do. In fact, just know, Paul wrote this to the church in Ephesus in chapter 4. He said, in your anger, do not sin. He didn't say don't get angry. He realized there's times we will get angry, and sometimes that anger is actually healthy. That anger is alerting to you there is a boundary violator in your life. There is somebody who is going too far. There is someone you need to engage. You may need a healthy boundary, whatever it may be. Identify a limit. It's okay to get mad, but don't sin, which, by the way, is a boundary from the Bible right there. A whole nother boundary right there. In your anger, don't sin. Which gets us to our so what moment as we kind of land the plane today. Tough series, but it's been healthy, the conversations that have come out of it. A lot of people have had to wrestle with some of these ideas. Some have been very challenged by them. This idea that spiritual health and emotional health go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. The question I've had to be asking in my life more and more these days is what limits, what boundaries do I need in this season of life? Realizing that we're all in different seasons of life, and it's just asking in my season of life, where I'm at, what I'm doing, what boundaries, what limits do I need in my life? And I would encourage you to ask the same thing. What limits do you have in your life? What boundaries do you need in your life? And the question I think we're asking throughout this entire series, as we bring it to a close, an important question even for today, but one that we all need to wrestle with, is this: who are you? Simple question. Who are you? Not the you you're pretending to be. Not the you that compares yourself to everybody else. Who is the real you? And here's why it's important to wrestle with that question. When you understand who the real you is, then you will have an understanding at that point of your real limitations. And when you understand and wrestle with your limitations, you will see the need for boundaries. But it starts by having an honest understanding of who you really, truly are in life. You have to be able to say, I have limits and I need boundaries. I have limits and I need boundaries. And when you truly wrestle with this question, who are you, and have honest dialogue about it, you will understand there's a freedom on the other side of that that maybe you have not experienced before. Because it's an understanding the real you. You see your strengths. You see your gifts. You see your talents. But you also have an understanding of your weaknesses and your gaps and your struggles. And then you understand in that in those gaps we may need healthy boundaries if I'm going to live in the freedom that I've been called to live in. But to do that, you have to accept who you are. Strengths, weaknesses, and all. And get honest and have an honest dialogue. Which means we have to, again, flip the switch on another way of thinking in our lives and say this: limitations are a gift. We have to see them as a gift in life, and it is the gift of freedom. You see, when we embrace our limitations, we know, I don't have to go there. I can't do this thing. Someone else may need to do this. Someone else may have to step into this thing. Understanding our limitations and who we are is a gift, because when we understand them, then we understand where we need boundaries, and when we live out those boundaries, we find freedom. Freedom to say, there are some places I don't have to go. There are some things I don't have to do. And there are seasons and times when I just can't do it. And when we live in that freedom, we realize that this gift that we've been given is a gift that says I don't have to pretend to be someone I am not. I can say no without guilt and shame. And I can enforce my boundaries in life without feeling unloving. And that is a freedom I hope all of us can live in. Spiritually and emotionally healthy Christians understand their limitations and the need for boundaries in their life. But it starts by asking that question we just asked. Who are you? Who are you really? It begins there. Let's pray.